There is a particular kind of evening that only exists at crossroads, the kind where the road behind you has gone soft with distance and the road ahead has not yet hardened into certainty. The amber threshold sat at just such a crossroads, on the old mountain road that wound down from the high passes of Vihal Dratha toward the lowland rivers, and it had been sitting there long enough that the stones of its foundation had settled into the earth like a sleeping dog finding its position. The sign above the door, a lantern painted amber, chipped at the corner, never repainted, swayed in a wind too gentle to be called wind at all. Inside, the fire had already been lit for hours. It did not roar. It settled and breathed, and gave off a light that made everything golden and a little soft at the edges. The worn wooden tables, the hanging dried herbs, the old maps pinned to the rafters above the bar where Dennick the innkeep had run out of wall space years ago. The maps were faded to the color of old honey. Some of them showed places that no longer existed. Some of them showed places that perhaps had never existed at all, or had not existed yet. Sarah Vale was already in her chair. She was always already in her chair when you arrived, though no one could ever quite say when she had come in from the road or whether she had been there all along. She had a cup of something dark and steaming that she turned slowly in both hands. She wore a coat the color of pine needles, and her silver-streaked hair was pinned back the way someone pins their hair when they want to think clearly. Her eyes, when she lifted them from the fire to the room, were the quiet gray of a sky that has finished raining, but has not yet decided what comes next. She smiled at no one in particular, or perhaps at everyone. It was the kind of smile that said, "Sit down, you have time. The night is long and the story is longer. I have been waiting to tell this one since before you knew to ask for it." "Shall we begin?" she said. With the morning the world first cracked. The village of Merrowfen had not always been an anxious place. Sarah Vale was careful to say that first, before she said anything else, because she thought it mattered. The way a person's nature before the terrible thing happened always mattered, always told you something true about who they were when the terrible thing came. Merrowfen had been, by most measures, an unremarkable valley town. It had a mill. It had a market square with a fountain in the shape of a leaping fish. It had a baker who started work before dawn and whose cinnamon rolls were considered, by unanimous local agreement, worth waking up for. It had a small wooden temple to a small local goddess whose domain was something between rivers and memory, the two things that flow without asking where they are going. Davin had grown up in Merrowfen. He was 22 years old and had spent the better part of his waking hours in the farrier's yard at the edge of the village, shoeing horses and repairing wagon wheels and doing the kind of physical work that left a person's hands rough and their mind clean and quiet. He did not consider himself unhappy. He was not particularly talkative. He watched things carefully, the way people watch things when they have learned that most crises announce themselves to an attentive eye well before they announce themselves to everyone else. He had noticed, the week before everything went wrong, that the horses were uneasy. Not frightened, not rearing or refusing their feed, but uneasy in the low animal way that has nothing to do with what can be seen or smelled or heard, and everything to do with something older and quieter. They shifted in their stalls at night. They kept their ears turned in the direction of the old mill, the one down the hill at the edge of the river bend, as if listening for something just below the threshold of hearing. Davin had noted this and said nothing, because he did not yet have words for what he had noticed, and he had always believed that observations without words should be held quietly until they became clearer. That morning they became clearer. It had started with Widow Perith, who ran the linen stall in the market. She had come out of her house at first light, sat down on her front step, and begun to weep very quietly. Not the way people wept for grief they already knew, but the way people wept for grief they did not yet understand, the kind that comes from somewhere deeper than memory, from the part of a person that knows things before the rest of them does. Her neighbors had come to check on her, gently, the way neighbors did in a town small enough that everyone knew which doors to knock on. She had told them, between careful, slow breaths, that she remembered her house burning. Not that she was afraid it would burn, not that she had dreamed it. She remembered it, the heat, the smell, the sound of the thatch going. She remembered standing in the street and watching it, and the memory was as clear and solid and real as any memory she had of her late husband's face, or the sound of her children learning to walk across the kitchen floor. But her house was standing, the thatch was intact, the morning was cool and damp and smelled of wood smoke from other chimneys, and nothing was wrong. By mid-morning, 8 other villagers had said the same thing in 8 different variations. Some remembered the fire consuming only the mill. Some remembered it beginning in the baker's oven and spreading. Some remembered it starting at the east wall, the west wall, the bridge. The details did not agree, but the fire itself, the fact of it, the weight of it in their memories, was something they all carried now, as solid as a stone. Solia heard about it by mid-afternoon. She was grinding dried lavender in the small back room she rented above the herbalist's shop, and the herbalist's daughter came upstairs with wide eyes to tell her what the market was saying. Solia set down her pestle very carefully. She went to the window and looked out at the village and the mountain beyond it, and she thought about the candle she had lit that morning for the river goddess, and how the flame had burned in 2 directions at once. She had not mentioned that to anyone either. Saravale paused here. She turned her cup slowly, watching the fire rather than the room, and when she spoke again, her voice had found that particular register it used when it was asking the listener to feel something alongside the understanding of it, not merely after. There is, she said, a difference between a prophecy and a memory. A prophecy comes to you from outside. It arrives like weather or like a letter carried from somewhere else and delivered into your hands. You receive it. You may choose to believe it or not believe it. You may tuck it away or act on it, but it belongs to the future, and the future has a certain comfortable distance. Memory is yours. It lives in the place where you keep all the things that made you. It is not separate from you, it is you, a version of you shaped by something that happened, preserved in that peculiar amber that the mind makes out of experience. When you remember burning, you do not remember it the way you remember a dream or a story someone told you. You remember it the way you remember being cold, or being held, or the first time you understood that someone you loved was not going to live forever. So when the people of Merrowfen walked through their ordinary morning, their ordinary market square with its ordinary fish fountain, carrying in their chests a memory of everything burning, that was not fear of the future. That was grief for something that had not happened yet. That was the particular awfulness of loss without the event that caused it, hanging in them like smoke. And somewhere beneath all of it, if you had asked them very carefully, they would have told you the strangest part. The memory felt true, not like something they had been told, not like something they had imagined. True the way cold water is true, true the way the smell of rain before rain is true. Davin had gone to the mill by the time evening came. He had told himself it was to check the wheel housing, which did occasionally need attention. He had not told himself why he was carrying a lantern 2 hours before dark. The mill sat at the bend in the river where the current slowed and the water went dark and thick with sediment. In summer, it was a pleasant place. The wheel turned, the millstone ground, the water made its constant conversation. In early autumn, as it was now, the river had a cooler quality, and the light that came off the water in the late afternoon had a silver thinness to it, like the inside of a shell. The mill itself was old, older than the village, some said, though no one knew exactly when it had been built or by whom. The stones at the base were a different color from the stones above, darker, and cut in a way that the local quarry did not produce. Davin noticed first that the birds were silent, not the ordinary silence of birds startled into stillness by approach. This was a prior silence, an absence that had been here before he arrived, that the birds had made a decision about and left for him to find. He noticed, second, that the water around the mill wheel was not moving the way water moved. It was moving in the right direction, downstream, as water ought, but it had a quality of hesitation, as if each small current was checking with the previous current before committing to its path. He stood on the bank for a long time watching this and could not quite make his eyes understand what they were seeing. He noticed, third, that when he held his lantern out over the water, the reflection was wrong. Not wrong in the way of a rippled reflection. He had seen that 1,000 times, the shimmer and distortion that water made of everything it held. This was wrong in the way of a reflection that showed something different from what was being held above it. His lantern threw its circle of amber light. The water below threw back a sky full of stars. It was mid-afternoon. The sky above was pale blue and cloudless, but the water held stars, not moving, not rippling, cold and certain and many, as if the river had decided to remember a different time of day and was declining to update. Davin crouched on the bank for a long time. A heron stood on a rock 20 feet away, also looking at the water, also very still. They regarded the situation together in the manner of two creatures who have agreed, without speaking, that they have both seen the same impossible thing and neither of them knows what to do about it. Imric arrived at the mill half an hour after Davin, and for entirely different reasons. He had been mapping the eastern edge of the valley, a private project, not commissioned by anyone, carried out in the slim hours between copying work he did for the magistrate's office and the eating of meals and the sleeping, and the mill was one of his reference points. He used it to triangulate the position of the northern ridge, the way its roofline sat against the mountain behind it, making a useful fixed angle. He had come to check his previous measurements. He had his notebook. He had his compass. He was not particularly interested in strange occurrences. He was interested in accuracy. He found Davin crouching by the water and said, with the direct practicality of someone who considered small talk an inefficient use of time, "Is the wheel moving?" Davin said it was not. Emric wrote this down. He looked at the water. He looked at the sky. He looked at the water again. He wrote something else down and then stood with his pen held at an angle that suggested he was unsure whether he was finished writing or had only paused. "The reflection," he said. "Yes," said Davin. Emric uncapped his compass and held it flat. The needle swung once, twice, and then settled pointing due east, which was technically correct, and then slowly, steadily, without drama, continued rotating past east through south through west, and kept going, settling into a gentle spin, as if compass north had simply ceased to have an opinion. Emric watched this for a moment. He wrote it down. There was something about the way he wrote things down carefully, without panic, as if the page were the appropriate place to put terrible information, and putting it there made it more manageable. That was, in its own way, reassuring. He was frightened, but he was also categorizing, and categorizing felt like a form of control, even when the thing being categorized was uncontrollable. "Has anyone," he said, still looking at the compass, "gone inside the mill?" Davin said no one had. The door of the mill opened on its own, slowly, in a wind that neither of them felt on their faces. Saravale smiled at the fire then, and it was a smile of the kind that remembered the shape of fear, not present fear, but old fear, recalled with the specific fondness that only comes once enough time has passed that you know you survived it. She had that kind of relationship with many things, it seemed, with narrow moments and peculiar thresholds and doors that opened without invitation. Thessaly had heard about the mill door by way of Petra Holtz, who ran the magistrate's office and who was Imric's immediate employer, and who had therefore received, within the hour, a written account of the compass and the reflected stars and the self-opening door, composed in Imric's precise, slightly cramped handwriting, noting each observation with a time and a brief descriptive phrase, and a column on the right labeled possible explanations, which contained, for the compass, 4 items. And for the starlit water, 2, and for the door, a single entry that read, *draft, unconfirmed. Thessaly had read this report twice, sitting at the corner table of the magistrate's office, where she conducted 3 afternoons of tutoring per week for the magistrate's twin sons, who were 9 and constitutionally opposed to geography. She had set it down. She had looked at the ceiling. She had thought about 3 things in rapid succession. First, the passage she had read 2 nights ago in an old philosophical compendium she had borrowed from the magistrate's personal library, about the theoretical nature of temporal blade, insights with strong metaphysical resonance. Second, the fact that she had, as a child, been told she had an unusual sensitivity to places with layered histories, and had dismissed this as the sort of thing adults said to children who stared at walls. And third, whether she was about to do something very sensible or very foolish. She put on her coat. She told the twins she would return the following afternoon and to practice their river names. She went to the mill. She was the 3rd person to arrive at the site of what would eventually be understood as the first recorded manifestation of what scholars, in the years that followed, would name a planar resonance event. She did not know that yet. She knew only that she was standing outside a mill that smelled of iron and old stone, that a door had opened before her without cause, and that inside she could see a faint amber glow that bore no relation to any light source she could identify. She walked in anyway, because she had always, in her quieter moments, suspected that this was exactly the kind of thing she had been waiting for, even if she had never been able to say waiting for what. The inside of the mill smelled of grain dust and river damp, and beneath those ordinary smells, something older, cold stone, and something faintly metallic, like the inside of a bell that has just finished ringing. The great millstone sat in the center, still, unmoving, the wooden gearing above it idle and dusty. The grain chute was empty. The miller had not worked this mill in 2 years, since his back had made the work impossible and his son had gone to the city. It had the particular quiet of a working place that had forgotten its purpose. The glow was coming from the floor, or rather from beneath the floor, from between the old foundation stones, where the mortar had crumbled and the gaps had let in river silt and small weeds and now apparently light. It was not orange like fire and not white like a lantern. It was a kind of light that had not quite decided what color to be, amber at one angle, cold blue-white at another, the way certain minerals looked in sunlight but deeper and more certain of itself. Davin crouched and pressed his hand flat against one of the foundation stones. It vibrated beneath his palm, not quickly, not in the way that things vibrated from mechanical cars, engines, or water wheels, or the hum of a plucked string. Slowly, once every several seconds, like a pulse. Thessaly knelt beside him without being asked and pressed her ear to the stone. She was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke carefully, in the tone of someone reading aloud from a text that surprises them. "It's counting," she said. No one asked what that meant. They all understood, in the wordless way that people understood things in places like this, that she was not using counting as a metaphor. There was a rhythm in the stone. Something down there was measuring, keeping time against a schedule none of them knew. Emric was writing. Bryn arrived last, having been sent by the herbalist, who had decided that whatever was happening at the mill was probably the business of someone with more knowledge of the natural world than herself. With a basket of practical supplies that included a length of rope, 2 additional lanterns, a jar of dried chamomile, and no instructions whatsoever. She had paused in the doorway, looked at the 3 people kneeling on the floor listening to the foundation, and set the basket down with the calm of someone who was constitutionally disinclined to be surprised by the behavior of either people or places. "There's an underground spring beneath this mill," she said. "There always has been. The old-timer who used to cut wood for my father said the builders chose the site because of it." She paused. "He also said the builders weren't from here." Saravale leaned back in her chair then, and for a moment the fire seemed to lean with her, the light shifting warm and gentle across the walls of the amber threshold, across the old maps and the dried herbs and the bottles lined up on the bar shelf, each one throwing its own small shadow. She took a long, slow sip of her drink and set the cup back on its spot on the arm of the chair with the precision of long habit. Bryn, she said, had a way of saying things that were not dramatic in the slightest, that were, in fact, entirely practical and factual and grounded, and which nevertheless landed with a particular weight. "The builders were not from here," said in the same voice as there is an underground spring, both pieces of information, both equally relevant, both delivered without emphasis, because she gave everything the same quality of attention and did not rank things by their strangeness, only by their usefulness. This was, over the years that followed, one of the most consistently valuable qualities she possessed. The 5 of them, 4, until Solia arrived an hour later, having decided after a long internal argument with herself that yes, the candle burning in 2 directions did mean something, and yes, she was probably required to go and see what stood in and around the old mill as the evening came down over the valley, and the mountain turned that particular shade of purple that it only ever turned in the last minutes before the stars appeared. They were not a group yet. They were 5 people in proximity who had been brought to the same place by different paths, by animal instinct, by methodical observation, by borrowed philosophy, by chamomile and rope, and a lifetime of listening to old woodcutters, by a candle flame that chose not to behave. They had no name for what was happening beneath the floor. They had not yet chosen one another. But the light in the foundation stones pulsed once in the gathering dark, and all 5 of them felt it in their feet at the same instant, and 5 pairs of eyes lifted and found one another, and something passed between them that was not yet trust and not yet friendship, but was the very beginning of the thing that preceded both: recognition. The wordless acknowledgement that the person beside you is also standing in the same strange place, also deciding what to do, also frightened in a way they have not yet organized into sentences. That, Saravale said quietly, is where all of it began. The murals were found when Emmerich, unable to resist the architectural evidence that the floor was not original, located a seam in the eastern wall and pushed, and a section of old plaster came away in a sheet to reveal stonework beneath that was carved rather than laid. The carvings were not decorative. They were precise, geometric, and interlocking, filled with a kind of visual language that none of them could read, but that Thessaly recognized, distantly, and with a chill of intellectual excitement she did not entirely want to feel, as related to a system she had seen in the compendium. In the plates at the back. The ones the previous reader had marked with a small notation in the margin that said only, "Do not." The murals showed figures, 7 of them, arranged in a formal grouping, each one wearing a crown. Not identical crowns, each was different, each carried a different kind of quality in the carving, as if the artist had been trying to convey not merely the visual shape of the crown, but the nature of authority it represented. One looked like branches, one looked like a ring of teeth, one looked like a bundle of measuring instruments. They were old. Even Bryn, who was not easily impressed by antiquity, ran her fingers along the bottom edge of the frieze and said the stone was cut before the current calendar was in use, which was not possible for a mill in a valley town. Below the 7 figures, the carved stone showed them kneeling. Not kneeling to one another, their arrangement suggested they were all subordinate to a single point below the frame of the image, something the carver had chosen not to depict directly: a deliberate absence, a negative space given the visual weight of a presence. Solia stood before the space where the subject of the kneeling should have been, and felt the river goddess's temple bell sound echo in her chest without cause. The stone beneath the carving was darker than the surrounding wall, darker and slightly smooth, as if many hands over many years had pressed against it, and the pressure of all those hands had polished it, the way a wish stone gets polished at a crossroads, the accumulated wanting of many people worn into something sleek and quiet. She did not press her hand against it. Something in her, the part that had been reading omens in smoke since she was small, the part that had learned to distinguish between a sign pointing toward something and a sign pointing away from it, said clearly and without elaboration, "Not yet." They stayed until well past midnight. Not because anyone decided they were staying, there was no formal agreement, no declared purpose, but because none of them quite managed to leave, and after a while the not leaving becomes its own kind of decision. Davin had gone out once to check on his horses, which were tied at the mill's hitching post, and which stood pressed together with their heads down and their ears flat in the direction of the river, and he had come back in because the horses' distress was not something he could remedy, and the inside of the mill, strange as it was, felt more comprehensible than the outside. Emmerich had filled 12 pages of his notebook. Bryn had lit both additional lanterns and distributed the chamomile into a tea that no one had requested but everyone drank, which was typical of her. Thessaly had located 3 more wall sections that sounded hollow, and Solia had sat cross-legged on the floor near the foundation glow and was doing something with her hands that might have been prayer or might have been an old herb woman's listening technique, and was probably both. The glow had changed over the course of the evening. It had become less ambient, less a general seep of light between stones, and more directional. It was pointing at something, or indicating something. It was doing what light did when it had an opinion. At a certain point in the small hours, the direction it indicated became unmistakable. A particular stone in the northeast corner, small, set slightly lower than the surrounding floor, cut with a different texture from all the others around it. Not the original foundation stone, or rather, not only that. It had been worked after the fact, fitted with something. Emmerich reached down and worked the stone free. It came up with the grating complaint of things long settled being disturbed. Beneath it, a cavity, dry and deliberate, and in the cavity, wrapped in cloth that disintegrated at the touch, a metal band, perhaps 6 inches across, finely made, heavy for its size. Covered along its inner and outer surface, in engraved text so small as to be nearly invisible, each letter cut with the precision of something that took a very long time, or cared very much, or both. Emmerich held it up to the lantern. The letters shimmered. "I think," Thessaly said, after a silence that had its own weight, "that these are names." She was, as she would prove to be in many things, correct, though the full nature of what she was correct about was something none of them would understand until much later. The next 3 days were strange in the way that days following a discovery are always strange, not because anything extraordinary continued to happen in the overt sense, but because the ordinary world had been recolored by what had been found, and nothing looked quite the same as it had before. The fountain in the market square with its leaping fish looked older and more deliberate. The way the road into the valley bent around the mill rather than running straight through made a kind of sense it had not made before. The fact that Merrowfen had no founding story, that when children asked the elders how the village had come to be, the answer was always some version of it, has always been here, no longer seemed like the ordinary forgetting of small places, but like something had been very carefully not remembered. Village itself had quieted into a tense waiting. Most of the residents with the memory of fire had stopped talking about it openly, not because the memory had faded, but because it had not, and the continued vividness of it was more frightening than its initial appearance, and in the absence of explanation, the community had adopted the silent working agreement that not speaking of it was a reasonable substitute for not having it. Children still played in the square. The baker still started before dawn. The cinnamon rolls were still remarkable, but there was a quality of effort in the normalcy, like a face holding an expression it was not feeling. Solia, who had gone back to her lavender grinding with the metal band sitting on a folded cloth beside her pestle, spent those 3 days feeling the thing she always felt in the presence of objects with accumulated weight. A low humming attention, not unpleasant, the way a healthy person felt the beating of their own heart. The band wanted something, not from her specifically, it was not demanding, not pulling. It was simply present in the way that very old things with very long purposes were present, with the patient certainty of something that had been waiting so long that it had made peace with the waiting. Emmerich had reproduced every inscription from the band in his notebook, cross-referenced against 3 almanacs and 1 translated fragment of old Sorcerer King scholarship he had found, improbably, in the magistrate's library. It had been misfiled between a tax ledger and a collection of regional weather patterns. He did not think it had been misfiled accidentally. It was Davin who noticed the bird first, though Bryn was the one who identified it. It had appeared on the 3rd morning, sitting on the rooftop of the old granary at the edge of the square, a bird of the general shape of a rook or a jackdaw, but wrong in the particulars. Wrong in the way its head moved, too precisely, with a mechanical quality, as if the turning of a head had been studied and replicated without quite understanding the loose organic casualness of how birds actually turn their heads. Wrong in the color, black at most angles, but in direct sunlight showing a metallic sheen that was copper and brass rather than the iridescent oil-slick of a real crow. Wrong in the eyes, which caught the light and did not give it back in the way living eyes gave back light, but held it flat and indexing. Davin had been watching it for 20 minutes before he found Bryn, because he was not a person who acted on partial information, and he had wanted to be sure he had seen what he thought he had seen. Bryn came and stood beside him and looked up at the granary roof for a long moment without speaking. "It's counting something," she said, which was an echo, deliberate or not, of what Thessaly had said about the stones in the mill. "Counting what?" Davin asked. "Us," Bryn said, "I think, or the village. It came from the mountains." She was quiet for a moment, from the direction of Vihal Dratha. Neither of them knew, at that point, what Vihal Dratha was in any meaningful sense. They knew it as the mountain nation to the north, the one with the organized roads and the trade policies and the masked sovereign whose name occasionally appeared in dispatches received by the magistrate's office, but who was no more real to them than any distant authority. A name on a page, a seal on a document. something that governed other people in other places. The bird watched them with its flat metallic eyes for another long moment. Then it spread wings that were slightly too quiet, no rush of air, no snap of feathers, and lifted from the granary roof and flew north, back toward the mountains, back toward the high passes, back toward whoever had sent it and was now, for reasons entirely unknown, interested in a mill at the edge of a valley town that had started remembering a fire that had not yet happened. Davin watched it go until it was a speck, and then nothing. "We should tell the others," he said. And Bryn agreed, because she had been thinking the same thing, and because this was, she thought, the point past which the five of them were going to be doing everything together for a very long time. Saravale set her cup down and was quiet for a breath. The fire in the amber threshold had settled lower and warmer, the logs gone mostly to coals now, and the light they gave was more intimate, amber and red, the kind of light that made everything look like it was being remembered rather than seen for the first time. The room was still. The inn sounds, the occasional shift of the building against wind, the low sound of the kitchen, the distant creak of someone turning over in a room upstairs, were the quiet sounds of a place being itself at rest, not sounds that interrupted, but sounds that deepened the silence between them. The bird, she continued, had not been the only watcher. There was another detail about that morning that none of the five had noticed, because it had not been the kind of thing that announced itself. It had been in the category of absences, which were always harder to notice than presences. The magistrate's office had sent, that same morning, 3 standard inquiries to 3 regional authorities, which was normal practice after an unusual incident, 1 to the church, 1 to the trade authority, 1 to the regional governor's office. Normal, expected, appropriate. What was unusual was that all 3 replies arrived by the following afternoon, which was, in practical terms, impossible. The nearest regional governor's courier station was 6 days away by fast horse. The church's nearest response office was 4 days. Even the trade authority, which maintained relay posts, was 2 days at minimum. The replies had arrived in 15 hours. All 3 had arrived in the same handwriting. All 3 said the same thing in different words, that the incident was being assessed, that the community should remain calm, that the relevant authorities were aware, and that no independent investigation was required or recommended. Emmerich had noticed this. He had set all 3 letters side by side and measured the letter forms against one another with the detached precision of someone who would have made an excellent forger and had instead become a cartographer, which was, he privately considered, a less criminal application of the same skills. Same hand, same ink. Same formulation in the 3rd paragraph about not requiring independent investigation, which was the kind of phrase that got included only when independent investigation was specifically what someone was hoping to discourage. He had shown the letters to Thessaly, who had read them twice, and then set them down with the expression of someone who had confirmed a theory they had hoped was wrong. "Someone very organized," she said, "already knows about this place." And since they now knew about the bird, they had a direction in which to point the word someone. The fire in Merrowfen did not happen on the day the villagers remembered. The day came and went, a gray-skied autumn day of nothing, of regular commerce and regular labor, and the baker's cinnamon rolls consumed in the regular quantity, and the fires stayed in the hearths and ovens where fires were supposed to be, and the mill stood, and the fountain leaped its eternal frozen stone leap, and by evening there was a collective exhale across the village that was not quite relief, because relief implied that the thing feared had passed. And everyone in Merrowfen still carried the memory as clearly as they had carried it before. What changed was not the memory. What changed was that it no longer felt like a warning. Zolia talked about this with Bryn on the afternoon of the not-fire day, sitting in Bryn's room above the stable where she had temporary lodgings, the 2 of them sharing a pot of ginger tea and watching the sun go down over the valley in amber and gray. She said, the memory felt true still. It felt like something that had happened, but it no longer felt like something that was going to happen. It felt like something that had happened somewhere else, or someone else. As if the event itself was real, but the relationship between it and this place, this time, this version of Merrowfen, had shifted slightly sideways. Bryn had a particular quality of listening that involved no movement at all, no nodding, no sounds of agreement, just a profound, attentive stillness, like water that was very deep and very clear and showed everything that came into it without distortion. She sat this way through Solia's explanation, and when it was finished, she said, "So the memory is of something real, but not something that happened here." Solia thought about that. "Maybe," she said, "or it happened here, but here is not as fixed as we thought it was." This was, as it turned out, correct. More correct than either of them knew how to understand that evening, watching the sun go down, the valley going blue and soft around them. But the understanding of it would come. It would come slowly and with cost, and with the kind of difficulty that understanding usually carried when what it revealed was the nature of reality itself. For now it was enough that they had the question. The right question, asked at the right time, was its own kind of discovery. Saraville was quiet again for a moment. A log shifted in the fire of the amber threshold, settling, sending up a brief constellation of sparks that rose and faded before they reached the mantel. The room had that late evening quality of places that are content, not happy in any effortful sense, just settled. The inn doing what it had always done, which was hold people inside its warm stone walls, while the night did what the night did outside, and the two things coexisting without requiring anything of one another. She had known them all by then, she said, not known them the way you know people after years of friendship, with the accumulated texture of shared meals and arguments and silences. She had known them in the early way, the way you know a place before you have spent time there, but you have studied the maps and read the accounts and stood outside looking at it and felt the recognition that comes from a convergence of the imagined and the actual. She had been, in those days, watching. Not following, she was careful to make that distinction. Not following, watching. There was a difference, she insisted, and her expression when she said it was the expression of someone who had been on both sides of that distinction and found them genuinely unlike. She had watched Davin talking to his horses at dawn in the way he always talked to them, not in the sentimental diminutive that people often used with animals, but in the level practical tone of someone briefing a colleague on current conditions. She had watched Imric recopying his notes by candlelight, not for utility, but for clarity, the act of rewriting being for him a form of thinking, a way of making the already written yield up what it had not yet said. She had watched Thessaly in the magistrate's library at the restricted shelf, running her finger along spines with the combination of caution and desire that marked someone who was being very careful not to take more than they were permitted, while wanting very much more than they were permitted. She had watched Solia in the early morning light with her hands in the river and her eyes on nothing in particular, listening. She had watched Bryn in the market, touching each herb the trader offered with the focused quality of a person for whom the physical world was a text they had been reading since childhood. 5 different ways of knowing things, 5 different relationships to the strange and the frightening and the possible. What none of them knew yet was how perfectly those 5 ways would fit together, like a lock made to receive 5 different keys at once, all of which had to be turned simultaneously, each one performing a function none of the others could. What none of them knew was that the lock was already waiting for them. It had been waiting, in the foundation of the mill, for a very long time. The letter from Vihal Dratha arrived at the magistrate's office 6 days after the incident at the mill. It was written on heavy paper, sealed with dark wax, and addressed not to the magistrate, but to the village of Merrowfen collectively, to the community of Merrowfen, in the matter of recent anomalous events, which was the kind of impeccable institutional politeness that was also, if you listened carefully, a way of demonstrating that the sender knew exactly where the power in the situation was not located. The letter said that the sovereign's office had been made aware of disturbances of a metaphysical nature in the Merrowfen Valley, and that a representative of Vihal Dratha would be in the area to assess the situation. It said the sovereign's interests in this matter were purely administrative and concerned primarily with the stability of regional order. It said that the residents of Merrowfen should feel no alarm and should not be impeded in their normal activities. It said any artifacts, objects, or materials of historical significance discovered in the vicinity should be held for assessment by the sovereign's designated representative. Thessaly read this letter aloud to the group assembled in the mill. They had been meeting there each evening now, almost by habit, as if the place were itself a member of the group who needed to be kept informed. And when she finished, she set it on the floor in front of her and looked at it for a moment. "It says feel no alarm," Emmerich noted. "Yes," Thessaly said. "That's the part I find most alarming," Emmerich said. The phrase "any artifacts, objects, or materials of historical significance" sat in the room with them. Solia had her hand near the metal band without quite touching it. Bryn was looking at the place where the carved figures knelt to their absent subject, and her expression was the expression of someone doing rapid arithmetic on a calculation they had not started. Davin said slowly, "What do we know about the sovereign of Vihal-Dratha?" The others looked at him. Then they looked at one another. Then they began, collectively, to realize that they knew very little, and that this was a gap that needed filling before the representative arrived, and that the filling of it was going to determine quite a lot about how they chose to proceed. Outside, the autumn night was clear and very cold, and above the valley, above the mountain, the stars were very bright. And from the floor between the foundation stones, the light pulsed once, slow and certain, as if it had heard the question and considered it a good one. There was something Saravale wanted to say about Vale Tirog before she introduced him. She wanted to say it now before he appeared, while the 5 people at the center of this story were still ordinary and uncertain, and in the process of becoming who they were going to be. She wanted to say it because it was easy, she said, in retrospect, to frame the story around the simplicity of opposition. Here the adventurers, there the sovereign, here the light, there the dark, and the simplicity was wrong. The simplicity had never been true, and being wrong about it early cost people, later, in the ways that mattered. Vale Tirog had grown up understanding things that most people did not. He had grown up in a time, a generation and a half before the events at Merrowfen, when the things he understood were considered academic, theoretical, the province of philosophers and deep archive scholars, and the kind of eccentric hermit mage who lived on a mountain and wrote letters that arrived already burned at the edges. He had carried that knowledge the way clever people often carried it in eras that had not yet decided to take them seriously, with a kind of compressed patience, like a spring that has been held down for a very long time and has made peace with the compression. He was not a simple man. He was not a cruel man in the way that cruel men were cruel, not carelessly, not for the pleasure of it. He was the kind of man who made decisions that cost people things and then spent the night accounting for each cost, not because the accounting changed anything, but because he considered it part of the price of the decision, the part he paid himself rather than distributing. He wore his mask, in those days, for reasons he had not yet shared with anyone. The mask was new then. The scar was newer. The understanding of what the scar meant, what it had let in, was something he was still in the process of arriving at, each day a little more of the truth settling on him like snow that had decided to stay. He had seen the mill report the same hour his bird had sent it. He had read it the way he read everything, once quickly for content, once slowly for implication. He had identified 6 items of significant interest and made 3 immediate decisions. He had written the letter to Merrowfen without consulting anyone, because consulting people was how you slowed down the work, and the work could not afford to be slowed. He did not know, when he wrote it, that 5 ordinary people in a valley mill were already asking exactly the right questions. He would find out. The last scene of this chapter, Saravale said, was a small one. She told it without drama because it deserved to be told without drama. It was the kind of moment that is only understood as significant in the looking back, and at the time had all the weight of a small, ordinary thing that turned out not to be. Solia had gone back to the mill alone just before dawn on the morning of the 7th day. She had gone because the river goddess's morning observance required water collected before light, and the mill's river bend had always yielded the clearest water in the valley, the current there running clean and straight. She had brought her jar and her small piece of temple cloth, and she had done what she always did, sat at the bank, filled the jar, held it up to whatever there was of pre-dawn light, said the words she had been taught as a girl, and had continued to say, not entirely sure she believed them, but certain that saying them changed something in her, even if not in the sky. Then she had gone into the mill. She was not certain why she went in. The door was not open. She opened it herself with her own hands. Inside, the glow from the foundation had dimmed considerably over the previous days. Whatever the discovery of the band had released or triggered had settled back into something lower and quieter, like a fire after the first fuel has been used. But it was there. It had not gone out. She sat down on the floor in front of the carved figures. She sat the way she sat at the river, cross-legged, steady, hands open. She looked at the 7 crowned shapes and the deliberate absence below them. She looked for a long time. Then she said, aloud, to nothing and everything, in the manner of someone who has decided that whatever is listening is worth addressing directly. We found something that belongs to you. We don't know what we're supposed to do with it. If you have any thoughts, I would appreciate hearing them in a way that doesn't involve my house burning. The light in the floor pulsed. Just once, slow, and then it was still. Solia nodded, as if this were an answer she had expected, or at least an answer she could work with. She tucked her water jar under her arm, stood up, smoothed her skirt, and went back out into the gray morning to do the rest of her ordinary day. She was not yet a cleric. She was not yet anything in the formal sense. She was a hedge witch's assistant in a valley town who had found the beginning of something enormous and had the presence of mind to say good morning to it. That, Saravale said, was worth remembering. Saravale fell quiet at last. The fire in the amber threshold had gone mostly to embers now, red and breathing, throwing warmth without throwing much light. The inn had the quality it always had at this hour, the quality of a place that has kept its promise, that has given what it set out to give, that is now resting in the good tiredness of work completed. The cups were mostly empty. The maps above the bar turned slowly in some draught too gentle to feel. Outside, if you listened, there was only wind in the mountain pines and the occasional voice of a night bird and the silence that was not absence but presence. The presence of a large, quiet world doing what it did, unconcerned with whether anyone was watching. She turned her cup once more in both hands. The fire found the cup and held it amber for a moment. This is where they begin, she said. 5 people who did not choose each other, who were placed by circumstance and curiosity, and a candle that burned in 2 directions into a mill beneath which something very old was measuring time toward a purpose none of them yet understood. They had a piece of a thing. They had the barest outline of a name, Vihal Dratha, the sovereign, the masked Iron Man to the north who had sent a bird and then a letter and would soon send something more. They had questions that were better questions than they knew. The world had already been cracking, she said, for longer than any of them had been alive. The cracks were just becoming visible. The way a fault line becomes visible not when the pressure begins, but when it reaches the surface, the way that first thin line in the stone is both the ending of a long patience and the beginning of everything that follows. They did not know, any of them, that they were standing on a fault. They did not know that the thing beneath the mill floor had been waiting for people who asked the right questions. They did not know about the 6 other fragments, scattered across plains and tombs and infernal auction houses and fabled routes. They did not know about the shape of what was coming. They knew a bird had watched them and flown north. They knew something old had heard them and answered once, slowly, in the language of light. They knew they were going to have to figure out what to do next, and that they were going to figure it out together. And that, for the first night, was enough. Rest now, the story will be here tomorrow. The inn will be warm and the embers will still be breathing and Saravale will still be in her chair. The mountain is quiet, the valley is still. Somewhere in Merrowfen, 5 people who do not yet know how much they matter to one another and to everything else are sleeping for one last ordinary night in their ordinary beds. Sleep.